Welcome, everyone, to the podcast of heaven. This is episode 13. Today, we have some very important information to discuss. Last week, I was on a big work trip and wasn't able to hear RFK and Trump's announcement regarding what could possibly be the causation with the autism epidemic. I'd heard that there was going to be an announcement, and so I was not in a place where I could watch it. And I had everybody I knew trying to tell me what he was saying and just the whole thing. Well, needless to say, I am both very excited that this is being addressed, and also I wish it had been done in a way that explained these scientific conclusions so that the general public could understand what's going on. Trump has a, a style of communication that is very hyperbolic, and he likes to repeat things, and that's not exactly the best way to communicate scientific information, even if the scientific information is true. So I don't think that the way he presented the information explained the causation well, and I'm here to help. So I hope you'll listen and I hope you will learn. So the first thing I want to explain is my own story with my son Houston, and here's what happened. Um, I do think that he did not produce enough glycoprotein. And for anybody who doesn't know, glycoprotein is a very important protein in your cells that is a cell identifier. It has absolutely nothing to do with, uh, you know, really any part of your intellect or your spirit at all. It basically is there to tell the immune system what's what, so that the immune system will not attack itself, the own body, his own body. So when he was born, he was developing absolutely perfectly. He had every single test there was. He got 100% on everything. He was the most perfect baby boy. And when he was 8 months old, he received the DTP HIV shot. And for those who don't know, that's the actual live cell version of what is now called the DTaP shot. So this was before that. Um, what I did not know at the time was this particular vaccine. There had been so many vaccine injuries that the pharmaceutical community had told lawmakers that they did not want to continue to produce these vaccines because they were getting sued so badly by people who were having vaccine injuries specifically related to that vaccine. And this was only a few years, actually, it really wasn't that long after Reagan signed into law. It was a very controversial law. It was actually thought that Reagan was going to veto it when it was passed. But basically, it gave big pharma immunity from any vaccine injury and set up a national vaccine injury fund to compensate for people who were injured. And I had never even heard of that. Even when Houston was injured and the hematologist said this is a vaccine injury, no one told me there was a vaccine injury court, nor did I know what the implications of a vaccine injury were going to be long term. But here's what happened. He received the shot. About a few days later, he started breaking out in these little red freckles. And he had, of course, the normal reactions that you would have with a vaccine where you have fever and things like that. And anyway, he started breaking out in these little red freckles. I didn't know what those were. I was like, that's weird. He seems too young to get freckles. And then the next day there were a few more. And then the next morning was a Saturday morning. And I went to get him up out of his crib and I went in and he was completely covered head to toe in these red freckles. I was like, oh dear, something's going on. So I went and I picked him up out of the crib. I went and got the telephone. Of course, this back one is still attached to the wall, and called the doctor. And it was a Saturday morning, and they said, drop everything you're doing and come to the doctor's office, which seemed strange, seemed like an overreaction. I didn't know what on earth that could mean. And I went to the doctor. He took one look at my son, walked out of the room, then came back a few minutes later and said, I've already had him admitted to Arnold Palmer Hospital. Would you like an ambulance? And I was just saying, why? And they wouldn't tell me. They said, we need to run tests. And so we went to the hospital. It's Arnold Palmer Hospital. And a hematologist met me in the room and she said, your son either has leukemia or immune thrombocytopenic purpura. And I knew what leukemia was, and I didn't know what the other one was. And I was terrified. And they poked and poked and poked him. They couldn't get an IV in him. It was torture. And by that time, he could hardly even see any place in his body that wasn't just covered in these red dots. What I didn't know was those red dots, those are petechia. And what was happening is he was bleeding to death internally. And the reason why he was bleeding to death internally was because his body was killing off all of his blood platelets. And after they tested, they said he doesn't have leukemia, he has immune thrombocytopenic purpura. And the hematologist says this is a vaccine injury. So for those of you who don't, believe it's a vaccine injury, you're wrong. And the hematologist knew exactly what it was and said so. And that was 1997. That was before the big campaign came out against, anti-vax and all of that. I didn't still even know what to expect. They gave him gamma globulin, they gave him all these things, and I just was afraid he was going to bleed to death internally. I really didn't even know what to think. I didn't understand what this was. I didn't know what any of those words meant. Interestingly enough, where it used to be called immune thrombocytopenic purpura, very, very quietly, they changed the name to idiopathic of unknown origin, although the hematologist knew exactly what the origin was. You see what some of those words in there mean, especially that immune thrombocytopenic purpura. The cyto is very important. That's actually an activity of the immune system. And I'll get to that in a minute. But anyway, I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know what was going to happen. I thought this gamma globulin was going to fix everything and it would all be okay. I just didn't know the extent of the damage and what had actually started. And a few months later, and he did start regressing before the next round of shots. And at the next round of shots, I didn't want to get them, which was the MMR. And the doctor, the pediatrician, the same one that had me sent to Arnold Palmer Hospital, says to me, I said, I don't want him to have vaccines because he clearly doesn't respond appropriately to them. I don't want them. And he pressured me and he said, that's a fluke. That was what my life got destroyed on, was a doctor saying that's a fluke. And I should have listened to myself, and I didn't. And I'm just being very honest in this one. So, but I'll get to the science. He continued to regress, and after the MMR, the things that started was massive gut issues, rashes, bleeding, the stimming and the sensory sensitivity, everything started escalating at a gigantic rate. Before that had happened, the first thing that I'd ever noticed was he suddenly couldn't clap. he like stopped. Of course, it's midline, right? He lost that ability. And then and he couldn't roll a ball. It was just these strange things. And I did notice him having trouble, especially after MMR. He would squint, he would just, and then the running away, then the chronic like acidic diarrhea, the fecal, of course, screaming, nakedness, it just, all down the list. And toe walking, pushing his head on the floor, um, obsession with water, obsession with, wanting the things in his hands. Um, I literally saw my son disappear right in front of my eyes. But it wasn't until years later that I began to try to understand what was going on. At the time, everyone was talking about mercury. So this is back before they had the internet. And I mean, I should say they had the internet. It was in its brand new stages. No one knew how to use it. There weren't any like regular search engines. So this was pre-Google. So I had to sit there and try to find, searching all over this internet for medical journals where I could try to find his symptoms and what was going on. I was looking everywhere I could. And at the time, I started coming across people that were talking about mercury. And I started looking up like, well, what are the signs of, mercury poisoning? And so I was like, oh, and there were some, I could see, okay, maybe that's it. Is there mercury in vaccines? I didn't know. No one told me. Literally, no one told me what is in them. Which, by the way, for anyone who wants to know, they put an adjuvant in vaccines. So, some back then, and actually, my son was also given the live oral polio vaccine, which how I did all these things to my son and just followed along what they said without any knowledge. I was from that generation where you do what you're told. The experts know better than you, and you do what you're told. Submission to authority. That was how I was raised. And it was hard to even conceive of doing something against what the experts said you should do. That was considered like rebellious or disobedient or foolish. And so I was a good obedient girl. So I was only 24 when my son was injured. So it completely destroyed my life as well as his and our whole families. But moving on. Um, when I finally went to was I finally got a doctor that would do um test his blood for metals, any heavy metals. They tested them. He had parasites, and and they did heavy metal testing, and they did, fungal tests. They did all these different tests. And so when I get the test results back, I thought that there were going to be all of these, all of this mercury, because that's all I had read about. And this is what I saw. So anything over this line right here, I know some of you are just listening, but it's basically a line towards the bottom of the page, and anything above that line is considered toxic. And the mercury was above that line. But over to the side was another line. And I was in shock at this line because this line went past the top of the page. It went past what the chart was even measuring. And that was aluminum. That's how much aluminum my 3-year-old had in his body. And I said, aluminum? Why is there aluminum in the vaccine? What's aluminum? I mean, all anything I knew about aluminum was aluminum cans, aluminum foil, like aluminum in, industry. I'd never heard of aluminum in a vaccine or in any product, really. I'd never even thought about aluminum being put in products that we use. Which, by the way, I just want everybody to know, in Germany, they do not allow you to cook with aluminum pans or anything like that. And I will explain why. Because they actually understand what aluminum is. That's why they don't allow that. Um, Now, let's get back to what Trump talked about. And that is that he said that there are studies that say that aluminum and mercury and Tylenol uh, are cofactors in what creates the conditions, the neurological and physiological conditions that we call severe autism. And I'm going to break all that down. And it's important before we break all that down to explain normal neural development. So when we are born, this is really cool. I found this great video, which I think you'll love. But when we are born, we are we're born with like, actually, I should go back to conception to tell you the truth. Let me do that real quick. There's this great video I found. Let's see, conception video. I had it pulled up um and whenever I got off my phone to put this to get on Zoom, I lost the video. So I'm hoping I can find it real quick. All right, here it is. Documented moment of conception. And the sperm enters the egg, and there's this light that comes off of it. Scientists are studying this and they're looking at it and they're like, okay, well, it looks like it's a release of zinc, a burst of zinc that comes off the egg and it creates this appearance. But any way you slice it, they can't explain away that light happens when life happens. Is that amazing? Light happens when life happens. I personally think that is incredible. And John 1:4. So if anybody doesn't know that, I'm going to read that for everybody. So John 1:4, and it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, right? That's how that chapter starts. And this is what it says. In him was life, and the light was the light of men. You see, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him. That means us. And without him, nothing was made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. So that light that happens at conception, that is his spirit, us made in the image of God. We have his image. We are image bearers. And that is when the moment when our spirit is connected to a physical body, and that physical body begins to knit and grow. And it talks several times in scripture about how we are fearfully and wonderfully made, how we are knit together in our mother's womb, and how he knew us before we were in our mother's womb. He knew us. That means we come from him. We are spirit. And I've discussed before how all matter comes from spirit. And that's, of course, what John 1 is talking about as well. And that he is the source of all matter. He's actually the source of all spirit as well. So we are made in his image, and then we are put into this body. And this body begins to grow, and the cells divide. And as it does, this spirit that we are is knit intricately, almost sewn together into this physical body. That is the process. As we are born, literally, we have that soft spot on the top of our head, which energetically is the crown, which is the one that is open to God. Okay. And this is normal neural development. We come into this world with zero motor, zero. We have none. All motor is learned. The only thing we have are basic reflexes. And those are like from the spine. Those reflexes are generated from the spinal cord. And as we are come into this world, we are absorbing as much sensory information as possible. And through this sensory information, we begin to make sense of where we are in space and where our body is in relationship to the environment. So both where is the environment, we're learning the environment, and then where are we in relationship to the environment? And they say the rate at which an infant learns is absolutely off the charts. And that's because they're actually not, they are just learning. They are absorbing everything and they have massive, 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 massive amounts of sensory synapses. And these sensory synapses are learning and absorbing the physical world as well as the metaphysical world. And that's important. So remember that piece, okay? So that's normal development. And then as we begin to have an established vestibular system, and your vestibular system is your body's GPS, and your vestibular system speaks to your proprioceptive system, which is in your muscles and your joints, and that's how you know how much force to use, how little or how much force to use. And we're constantly adjusting that, and our body does that without any actual conscious thought. It's all just reaction. And the reason why it can adjust so instinctively is because of the next stage of development. And what happens in that stage of development is as your body figures out where it is, it begins to develop motor. And this motor in the beginning is very, very basic. This is why that early stage where you're getting those basic motor skills down is so critical, and why later on more advanced motor skills are actually lost if you don't have the primary motor skills. This is why they say people who didn't learn to crawl or didn't crawl very long have bad handwriting, because it's actually a gross motor function that has a fine motor connection. So that you always have to establish that the groundwork before you can establish the execution of the fine motor. So as your body begins to develop this gross motor, and I remember like one of the basic things were like, hand to mouth, like literally getting your hand to go to your mouth. Like this is a major, huge thing, is to figure out where your hand is, where your mouth is, and how to get your hand to get to your mouth. Like that's huge. And we kind of act like it's nothing, but it's actually this incredible miracle. Anyway, as you develop motor, the brain begins the process of pruning sensory synapses. And it doesn't do this all at once. It does it gradually as your body acquires new motor. Then it begins to prune the next sensory synapses. And as it acquires the motor, what's happening is it's taking the pruned sensory synapses and it's integrating in with the motor neural pathways. So these things are together. And that's why the vestibular and proprioceptive system can act instinctively without you actually processing a thought, because they are so completely intertwined. So as soon as the sensory system senses something, it actually adjusts the motor and the motor planning based on what it senses without you consciously thinking. So that's normal development. And of course, all motors learned, and the more and more you figure out your environment and figure out your motor, the more sensory pruning happens. Now, this happens throughout your childhood, but the intense sensory synapse pruning happens in those first years of life. Now, that's normal development. Now, this is because you still have all those sensory synapses. And I told you you're both processing and learning your physical world as well as still learning the metaphysical world. This is that state of being where you're like a child, where you sense the spiritual, you sense God, you sense angels, you sense, people who have passed. This is why little kids will talk about seeing angels, or they'll talk about like grandma who died. I mean, there have been some fantastic videos that parents have caught of their kids talking to someone who died. like seeing them, and it was and even seeing like orbs come into the video and everything. It's really incredible. And these are just like all on the security videos. I'd love to show those sometime, which we can get to, but right now we're talking about medicine and chemistry. So that's what we're going to do, and physiology. So that is actually that state of being where you're so open to the spirit, like you have faith. And that's what, where God says, unless you have the faith of a child, you cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. You have to be in that state of being so wide open to believing that you come from God, that you belong to Him, that you seek Him. Like that's home. And of course, we all come from Him. And so anyway, moving on. Obviously, as those sensory synapses pruned, we get better and better at using our physical body because our motor develops. And as we develop more motor, we also develop more, we start to use, the left side of our brain a lot more. And that's where, of course, where we develop all this critical thinking and analysis and logic and all of this. And of course, we can become further and further detached from our spirit, from sensing, from intuition, from the knowing, the deep, deep connection to God. Now, two vaccines. All right. Remember when I told you about the chart with the big, giant, huge line all the way to the top? That's what it looked like. Aluminum, and by the way, what they put in the vaccines is aluminum hydroxide, which is in a nanoparticle. Okay. And I don't know if you know what the MITCUS study is, but the MITCUS study is just a total piece of fraud. And it basically used aluminum salts that are like antacids. And they did a study on aluminum, in fact, like if aluminum causes autism. And they basically gave people ingested like an antacid um, in different amounts. And of course, the chemical structure is different. And then they said, see, it doesn't cause autism, even though what happens with aluminum hydroxide is it's injected into the intramuscular, it's in a nanoparticle that can bypass the blood-brain barrier. And of course, it's given in infants. So it's an entirely different chemical process. But aluminum hydroxide also, don't know if you know this, man-made. Biggest manufacturer of aluminum, Canada. Yeah, that's who is making the aluminum. And it's a huge, 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 huge industry, of which vaccines, I actually looked up the amount that they make from vaccines and I can't remember it, but it was in the billions. So yeah. Mhm. Anyway, so we're not just fighting the big pharma industry, we're fighting the aluminum industry as well as you know the politicians who get money from big pharma and from the lobbies, as well as the media, all the media outlets that get ad dollars. And you can see where this is becoming just like every single institution, every powerful institution, and they're funding all of these institutions. And so it's in none of their interest. And of course, as well as the American Academy of Pediatrics, which is just horrific. Anyway, all of these organizations are now have an interest in withholding the truth at our expense, at our children's expense. So I'm going to tell you, what is it with aluminum? Aluminum has an atomic number of 13. That means it has 13 electrons. So how electrons work is they like to be in pairs. And I've drawn a little diagram for you. So you have your little nucleus here, and you've got the first shell can have up to 2 electrons, okay? And then the next shell, it's got a circle here, and it can have up to 4 pairs. You have 2, 2, 2, and 2. Okay, so the first shell has 2, the second shell has 4 pairs, so we're at 8. That leaves 3 because it's 13. Now, the outer shell is called the valence shell. The valence shell is what determines how electronegative or reactive an element is. In the case of aluminum, we have one pair, which gives it some stability, and then we have one. So now it's got all of this desire to fill this whole shell, which makes it highly reactive. So what it does is it starts attracting electrons from other cells, which then, so it steals an electron from another cell. Now that cell is missing an electron, so it steals an electron from another cell. This continues until what they call homeostasis is reached, which is stability. All right. Now, in one person, they can reach that state of homeostasis very quickly. But in someone else, it continues unabated, stealing electron after electron after electron after electron after electron. And the reason why they actually put aluminum in vaccines is because of this electronegativity, because what they use is it's called an attenuated virus, which means it's supposed to be a dead virus. So it's not active enough to trigger the immune system. So they put an adjuvant in the vaccine in order to trigger the immune system. So they need the adjuvant to trigger the immune system. And unfortunately, the reason why they were given this immunity is because they told Congress they couldn't make it safe. And they were right. They can't. That was the whole reason they were given immunity, was because they couldn't make the vaccine safe. And the reason they can't make the vaccine safe is because they can't control that cellular reaction. There is no way they can control it. In one person, it reaches homeostasis just enough to trigger the immune system to react and blah, blah, blah. And then in someone else, it is just as complete cellular oxidative fusion reaction, basically, which goes off unabated without any control. Obviously, this triggers the immune system. But in a situation like that, where you've got so much reaction going on, you have triggered a cytokine storm. This is where, remember, I talked about the cyto from immune thrombocytopenic purpura. That's what I was talking about. So this cytokine storm, the cytokine is basically an action of the immune system, and different antibodies and everything will start triggering. And what triggers, and this is actually there's a whole list of doctors who've actually done the study on the elevated amounts, long-term elevated amounts of this particular part of the body, and it's called interleukin-6, part of the immune system. It's called IL-6. And when IL-6 is triggered, and this massive cytokine storm of IL-6, it causes massive organ, neurological damage across the entire body, most significantly liver, kidney, bowel, and encephalopathy of the brain. It causes inflammation and disorder in all of those organs, but particularly encephalopathy in the brain, chronic inflammation of the brain. This is where it gets interesting. So the inflammation of the brain, remember, this brain is still in this like young neurological development state where it still has all these sensory synapses. And if the brain is inflamed, especially chronic inflammation, what the brain will not do is it will not prune itself when it's inflamed because it's trying to protect itself. And if it does not prune, then the motor can't develop. And if the motor can't develop, it can't connect with the sensory. And this is what creates the brain-body disconnect that we know as severe autism or global apraxia. In addition to that, you have the liver, which can't detoxify. I should also mention, by the way, they put formaldehyde and a bunch of other chemicals in the body, which this is where Tylenol comes in. All right. I want you to know who actually has done the research. So you have Harvard John Hopkins, Columbia, Mount Sinai, and they've all done studies saying that acetaminophen lowers glutathione. And glutathione, if you lower the glutathione, you disrupt the liver's ability to detoxify. Anything that lowers the body's ability to fight a fever, like whenever you lower a fever, when they're having an immune reaction, like you're actually lowering their ability to fight, the body's immune system to fight. And so basically that's it. I mean, it's the acetaminophen lowers the glutathione, which makes it much more difficult for the body to detoxify and for the immune system to have the appropriate reaction to heal itself when it's been compromised. And that is why Tylenol is connected. It is not the cause, it is a contributing factor that prevents the body from functioning the way it needs to heal. And by preventing the body from healing, the body is left in a chronic state of inflammation and not allowed to go through the normal neural development process. As those organs are damaged, especially the gut is responsible. In fact, your gut is actually develops before your brain does. I don't know if anybody knows that, but yeah, it's critical. Why? Because the gut creates the neurochemicals, the neurotransmitters that the brain needs to send messages. So then if the gut is damaged, it cannot send the chemicals that the brain needs in order to send messages to the body. So this, of course, matches what these non-speakers and spellers have communicated. I know we're trying to move away from the non-speaker word, and here's just real quick, I just want to talk about that. I love just using the word spellers, or some have said voice spellers, or I love all of those. And I guess what I'm struggling with is a word that encompasses the individuals that we know that we should be presuming competent about, that we should be presuming competence about, but have not yet begun to spell. So who either haven't heard, who I don't have a name yet for them. And I want to just go ahead and call them spellers, but they're not yet spelling. So I'm open for ideas. If anybody has a great name, I would love to have a wonderfully beautiful, hope-filled, competent, presuming name that includes all of these individuals. And also, I just want to say another word really quick. In this whole theme of names, and people like to use the term neurodivergent. And another mom put in there, it was just another brilliant statement. I love all these moms, they're so brilliant. But she just made a very blatant statement. It was so simple. I was like, why haven't I ever thought of that? It's so great. It said, neurodivergent is not neuroinflammation. There we go. If you're neurodivergent, good. If you're neuroinflamed, then you have a lot of disruption and dysfunction that is preventing you from having control and autonomy of your body. And that is necessary and important and critical to have a dignified life and be able to pursue the life and have the autonomy of your life so you can live the life that you want instead of having to be dependent on everyone else to feed you, wipe you, clean you, do every other basic function, and even also needing someone to communicate with you. They want to be able to communicate independently, and we want that for them. And that means they need help to decrease the inflammation and to create neural pathways so they have the roadmaps in their body to be able to send messages so their body can receive them so that they can execute the motor. And as we're talking about motor, just so everybody knows, motor has absolutely nothing to do with intelligence. Motor is a neural pathway. It's a road. The brain executes the message, and if there is no road, it can't send the message to the road. This is why the body acts like no one is navigating it. Houston describes it as having, it's like was cut off access to his navigation and to his controls. It's like the body is the plane or the ship. And if you are cut off from the navigation and from the controls, how on earth could you navigate this vessel? You're still in it, but you can't navigate it. And unfortunately, all of the intelligence tests and all of the ways that we assess and we appropriate, value, which is horrible that we do that, but that's what society has done. They appropriate value based on motor. And that's a completely unrealistic expectation for people who have been cut off from their motor. You can't put their value on their motor when they don't have access to their motor. And that really goes back to the whole thing that one of our good friends said, where he said, behavior, because all of this is called behavior. And he says, behavior implies intent. If there is no control, there is no intent. And that's just so true. If you can't, in legal terms, this is, there has to be intent, right? And intent without control, like if you don't have access to the control, then you shouldn't be held responsible for something you literally do not have control over. This is why so many of these aspects are important in law. Why aren't they important here? And why isn't it important and reasonable for the public to listen and understand what is going on in their bodies and what caused this situation? We need to be willing to hold the institutions accountable for lying, for poisoning, for refusing justice, for trying to cover up, for continuing to injure even when they know that they are destroying lives. And also, I want to say a little bit about the manufacturers of Tylenol. There are actually, you should go to Children's Health Defense, and they just released this wonderful article. And I spent some time reading it and going through and actually reading the emails, the internal emails. So you have Tylenol going, Tylenol has nothing to do with autism. But if you actually go and you look at the emails in between these corporate executives, they were scared to death because they actually saw the correlation between the glutathione and the and what it did to the liver and how that affected the immune system. These are internal emails that have been released, and you can go read them yourselves. I encourage everyone to do that. Go to Children's Health Defense. By the way, that place is just a treasure trove of truth. Stop listening to headlines and go do the work. The reason that we're in so much of a mess these days is because people don't read. They don't take the time to do the hard work and read long articles and read long books and understand the complexity of physiology and chemistry and biology and environment and how these all are interrelated. One of my favorite quotes was, it's a quote by Thomas Paine, and I think it was in Common Sense. And he said or it might have been in the essay that he wrote after that. I can't remember. But he says, they are remarkable drawing sudden conclusions from single facts. And that is what I need all of you to stop doing. I need you to take responsibility for the information. Do your homework. Read, dig. If you have one set of information, make sure that other information is going to support that. Make sure that you've done all the research. Look at the links. Look and see if a study is biased. Look at what other people are saying about this, and just do the work. Now, to understand the process of vaccines on the body. Oh, actually, there's a wonderful uh, speech that I can't remember his title, but basically he was in 1970s. It was in the 1970s, and he came out. He was like had a I can't remember, but something big in medicine. And this is a horrible job. I can't remember his name, but he basically came out and he said he was warning everybody about vaccines and saying that you would be remiss to address the drop in disease to this single factor. And he went and basically was just exposing that there was flawed thought, flawed conclusions, and that they were only considering one factor and they weren't considering any of the other factors that were involved. And he challenged them to actually look at other contributing factors. In light of that, I would like for you to read the book Dissolving Illusions. It is a massive book. Which I actually don't have, I think I put it in my room. It's over 700 pages with medical charts. It's a history of disease and medical treatment in the modern world. It discusses actually the whole history of where vaccines came from. There was a man named Jenner, and was his whole idea. And by the way, like some of these things that they actually put in these, they are using pus from animals to create a vaccine, even though the actual virus that humans get is different, but they were like, oh, this is close enough, so this will just use this. But they were using the viruses for other animals and putting them in humans, even though the human virus that humans would get would had a totally different chemical structure. And they were thinking that the body would somehow develop an antibody for the human disease, even though they were putting in the body an animal virus. They actually had whole, vaccine farms of these animals that they would basically let them get infected and then scrape the pus off of them and inject it into people. They use a lot of the hand, foot, and mouth. That was actually a cow disease this is why humans started getting it, because they started giving them, they put that in us. Um, they are putting in monkey pox is actually because they're putting monkey uh, viruses in people, that people are now acquiring these diseases. It's not natural for them to acquire that. It's from injection. And they're basically using people as guinea pigs for medical experiments without their knowledge or consent. And the number of, ethical violations is just catastrophic. And it's time for us to hold these institutions and individuals accountable. I also have some real problems with how the government can take away our rights because we actually have that no one should be deprived of life, liberty, or due process. And they literally took our right to due process away, which I have some big issues with that. Anyway, clearly there's a lot of stuff in this episode that's challenging, and I hope I've explained it in a way that you can understand. It took a lot of research and time for me to understand this in a way that I could share it with other people. But we don't have to be afraid of knowledge. It's actually empowering. And the reality is that God gave us these incredible bodies, and He gave us with proper nutrition, with proper environmental conditions, with proper rest, with love, with using plants and herbs and appropriate care, that our bodies are tremendously capable of healing. And I don't know if a lot of people know that, like, one of the reason that, like, measles actually completely almost like went down to almost zero before they ever actually introduced the MMR vaccine. I don't know if anyone knows that, but also, I would like to say one small word about maternal onset, which is basically where a baby is born and they don't have regressive autism. They just always seem to have autism. That is actually a thing. Dr. Patterson is actually the first person who found that, and he actually found the same thing that they found in children later, which was the elevated levels of interleukin 6, which means they have had an immune event. The immune system was compromised, which could be from Tylenol. It may be, it may not be. I'm not saying it is for sure, but it's absolutely something to understand what these medicines that we're putting in our body, what their actual chemical properties are, and how the body responds to those chemical properties. And this is just, that means we shouldn't just, because the pharmacy sells it, we need to do the work to make sure that our body will respond well to it. And that's personal responsibility. And all of this to say that my favorite part of this message is going to be Jesus. And that is, he named himself the Lord who heals. His name is Jehovah Rapha, the Lord who heals. By his stripes you are healed. And it talks about in how that everyone was brought to him and he healed them of all their sicknesses and diseases. And that's because that's who he is. He's the Lord who heals. And I realized that this part is hard because we've been taught that, we've come up with our own answer instead of looking to him for the answer. And so I just want to encourage everyone to look at what Jesus says, look at what God says about himself, that he heals. It's his desire to heal. It's his will to heal. And it is through faith that we receive his healing. And I can go into much detail about that later, but I thought it was appropriate to include it in this message. Let me know if you have questions. Hopefully I've answered some. Hopefully I did it in a way that wasn't political, maybe a little political, but to me, I don't feel like it's political. I just feel like it's the right thing. Um, how can injuring children and covering it up and abandoning families that you've injured and lying to them be the right thing? Also, one other thing, the whole premise is based on that if you give your body these viruses, that they'll develop the antibody to fight it for the rest of your life. Unfortunately, what they are now finding is that that's not the case. It's not what the body does at all. Dissolving Illusions, again, by Dr. Susan Humphries, does a fantastic job of explaining the what they thought the immune system did in response to an immunization than what the body's actually doing in response to an immunization. And the antibody that the body produces when it naturally comes into exposure and is exposed to disease, the antibodies it produces there are actually lifelong, whereas the one that it produces from an immunization, it is not. The body does not produce the same antibody, and this is why they keep having to revaccinate, because it actually doesn't consistently heal. I hope I've given you a lot of food for thought, and I'm definitely open to questions. Guys, we can do this. We can change the world. We really can. Take care until next time.